Hi, Julia again. In this short video, I'm going to be discussing some potential problems of assessing students who might be English learners and who might have a disability. In the previous video, I talked about how we could get a number of different possible combinations. We could have the result of the evaluation could be that the student is not an English learner and does not have disabilities. It could be that the student is an English learner and has a disability. It could be any combination. But there's three areas that I see of real concern here. During the process of identifying whether the student is an English learner, we can either incorrectly identify that they are or incorrectly identify that they are not. One of the ways that we might incorrectly identify a student as not an English learner is when we do not actually administer a language proficiency assessment. My perception is that schools have become much better at actually following through and administering language proficiency assessments. They might be inappropriate for the students, but they seem to be doing this, especially since the advent of the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act as Every Student Succeeds Act. So therefore, most states are attempting to assess children, even those with complex support needs. However, not all states have an alternate language proficiency assessment. And those that are available may not be the most appropriate. You can see some research that I have published with Dr. Rosalia Pacheco and Dr. Sunaina Shenoy if you're more interested about that. So when students are not referred, it can result in underrepresentation because they may be really an English learner, but we don't identify that. Sometimes we can over-identify students because the language proficiency assessment is not appropriate. So instead of really identifying whether they are an English learner, what we're really identifying is that they have a presence of a disability. And that can be a result of inappropriate instruments or an inappropriate assessment process. So for example, if a student is having difficulty reading because they have a reading disability, they may continue to demonstrate difficulty with the reading and perhaps writing portion of a language proficiency assessment, even though they know English well, but it's the disability that is causing them to have a lower score on the language proficiency assessment. The same thing for students with complex support needs who have communication and perhaps language challenges. They may never be able to communicate at a high enough level to score as proficient, but it's not sometimes because they are English learners, but because their disability means that they will never, perhaps, be able to develop language at the level that would indicate proficiency of English. That's a real problem. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with students with complex support needs. So I do want to emphasize that students with complex support needs with a home language other than English must be administered a language proficiency assessment. That is part of federal law. The IEP team will determine whether these students are eligible to take an alternate language proficiency assessment or the regular language proficiency assessment. So for example, for over half the states that participate in the WIDA consortium, they would determine whether they take the alt access or the access for ELLs. One of the challenges is that because language proficiency is based upon state English language development standards, students with global communication deficits, as I mentioned in the previous slide, likely will continue to be identified as English learners, even when they actually have a greater proficiency in English than the home language. But again, we are measuring the level of disability, not the level of English proficiency. And then the third potential problem um, is when we are trying to determine special education assessment. Just as sometimes we don't refer um, learners with more complex support needs for language proficiency assessment, sometimes English learners are not referred for special education assessment, especially in early grades, because there's that idea that they're going to um, learn English, and the assumption that the problem is all due to English. And that can result in under-identification of English learners with a disability. The second problem can then be when those students hit third and fourth grade, especially, and they are reading to learn instead of learning to read. And all of a sudden, the teachers are noticing they're having a difficulty, and there may be an overrepresentation because students at that point are referred for special education, and the test is not adequately, the assessment process is not adequately determining whether they are an English learner or they have a disability. So, for example, Sampson and Lasso's 2009 research really looked at this by grade level and found in the early grades that there was underrepresentation of English learners identified with disabilities, and in higher grades, we had English learners who were over-identified.